Okay, so good morning, everybody. Lovely to see so many here. And I'm delighted to announce this is the first talk in our sixth global seminar series. And the talk is entitled The Power of Together, Building a Unified SoTL Landscape. And it's being delivered by Professor Earle Abrahamson of the University of Hertfordshire, who is a professor there in scholarship and has done amazing work with implementing scholarship across the university and others. So, Earle, it's over to you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the kind words and the welcome. Welcome all. And it's wonderful to be here. And I have a slide deck which I'll share in the next few seconds. But really, the ideas that are present and presented are there to spark a discussion at the end and provoke different ways of thinking about the scholarship of teaching and learning and how we move from working in silo, working alone, to working in synced, working as one, bringing ideas together to address some of the issues we may face within the context of our own work, but equally within our centers that we based. So I'm hoping I'm sharing the right screen. Um, I, I can still see you on the side, which is great. Is that big enough for you? I'm just trying to see if we can go into presenter mode, and I'm going to minimize that. Martina, I'm just going
Yeah,
to ask you, if I exceed time, please be strict and say you've got 10 minutes or you've got 2 minutes left, and
I
I'll
will do.
stop because I definitely do want to leave time for discussion.
Yes.
Great. So I've just changed a little bit the title just to invoke some ideas and encourage us to think about different ways of working. And yes, I am going to retain the title in white letters at the top, The Power of Being Together, but equally how we move from probably working in a silo to working in synced together, but creating this vibrant, I'd like to think about these ideas as probably engaging, vibrant, colorful, but yet a challenge, and how we create this vibrant, subtle network. And I'm going to propose a model that may be useful in helping us to discuss these ideas right at the end. Now, the imagery you see on this first slide is often I saw myself as a lone person working in a silo, doing my scholarly work, but almost afraid, scared to discuss the work I'm doing in fear of not having that value or recognition of the work I'm doing. So my background is really in clinical sciences, anatomy, and I was working in a sports science faculty or department, and my colleagues would say, why are you researching teaching and learning? Why aren't you looking at your discipline as the main route? And it wasn't that I wasn't, but I didn't make explicit the value of actually thinking about different ways of teaching, different ways of learning, and helping students to make their learning visible so they could become the best graduates that they could be. So my talk is really about my lived experience, my learned experience, and more recently, my led experience. So from being the solo bird is now sitting on a line and inspiring others and creating those open lines to discuss, debate, challenge. So part of my work now is working in a central team, supporting staff, encouraging the growth of scholarly work. But the other part of my role more recently is leading the teaching and learning and scholarly strands within our new medical school. So we are opening a new medical school in 2026, and that idea of what does teaching and learning, the educational strands, mean within the context of a widening access higher education centre within the UK. So I just wanted to frame that as a starting point. But because times have changed and times are constantly evolving, I thought back 4 years, knowing what will happen in the next few months, our colleagues joining us in the States, There is a change, and I have to go back to the empowering words that Amanda Gorman spoke at Joe Biden's inauguration 4 years ago. And this was from a poem that she had written. And I've extracted a few lines, and the poem was titled The Hill We Climb. And I think that imagery of that hill, of that challenge we actually face, and thinking about that we are still a process. We in the process of becoming, we in the process of being, but we also need to be in the process of belonging. So the lines that I want to extract is that the work I'm going to be speaking about is far from polished or pristine, but it doesn't mean that I'm striving for a perfect goal. What I'm trying to strive for is to create a network that has meaning, purpose, intent. So it's actually finding that meaning within the context of my practice as well as my work. So what I do to start out with is I think about myself, but I also think about the vision I have. And when I move from working alone to working in larger groups, and I've been fortunate to lead groups at Hertfordshire around the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, but I also co-chair the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning's outreach group. And that is about bringing different voices, different visions, different ideas in a global setting together to think about the future and what matters most when we think about scholarly work. And I've also been fortunate to be on the SoTL board, and we have our conference. This is a shameless plug, but there's the SoTL conference in Holland in 2025, and it may be a wonderful way for this group to engage with Europe-wide as well as global scholars around some of the research we're doing, challenges we face not only within our home setting, but extending across those borders. And what I think about, the words that help me to align the networks I'm working with, is this idea of working together as a community or as a landscape of practice, the compassion. We're working in multiple muddled, confused cultures at times, but we need to be able to inquire. We need to be able to be curious, but we also are committed to a cause. And at times I felt through my learnt and my lived experience that you need to engage with courage. You need to be brave enough to stand out and really discuss issues that have meaning as opposed to just agreeing with what the rest of the group says. But for me, the most important thing from moving from working in a silo to working in synced, the connections I've made to enable the collaborative approach I now adopt. And that has helped me to lead the collaborative writing groups. And these groups are really about bringing scholars together to produce either an article or an artifact. And that's important because those lenses in writing change. So if any of you are interested in being part of an initiative we're bringing in with the SoTL event in 2025, please look out for that call of being part of the SoTL writing group. And that can give you a different lens in terms of some of the criteria, the scholarship, the research that these groups are thinking about. What I'd like you to do, I'm just going to pause. You can put your answer into the chat, or please feel free to speak through this or unmute. But I'd like to know what other word, it doesn't need to start with C, what other word do you think defines either the value or the threat of building or sustaining a network within your context of practice? So you are part of the IFNTF, a network that is doing outstanding work. But what word defines your role within this particular group? I can't see the chat, so I'm just looking at my slides. So if there are comments in the chat, maybe one of you could read them out. I'm just interested to understand your thinking at this time.
So far we have, Earle, we have creative,
Creative, brilliant. I love that.
rhizomatic, if I've said it right,
Yeah,
trust,
yes,
inclusion,
lovely.
coordination,
Yes.
assemblage,
Mm.
honesty,
Yes.
confidence,
Yep.
appreciative inquiry,
Yes.
culture,
Right.
intersection,
Wow.
and finally we have reflective.
Brilliant. And those are so important, those words. Each one of them brings a value trait as well. So it's a question of, do you bring those words, those lived experience, values into the work you're doing, or are those the kinds of values you expect to take out of the work you actually bring? So I just want you to pause on those thoughts and we'll discuss those right at the end. Thank you. Those are wonderful words, and I don't want to lose them. So what I often do in terms of framing the work I do, instead of just speaking about the I and the I like to do an I test. So I often like to test in a forum such as the one we engaged in, is my learning and teaching vision clearer with or without partnership, collaborators, context, connections, institutional drive, international networks? And when does our vision blur? And what lenses enable us to flourish, but also what lenses detract or distract from us being able to do this, sending us back to silos, ice in working alone? So think about how you would fare on a test and think about how you would respond to the vision that you have for your work and the vision that you may want to share with the people you work with. And often they may not share that same vision. So how do we connect our lenses? How do we connect our thoughts? Is it that we still need to work alone? Is it that we need to bring smaller groups together to get a clearer sense of what stands out, but also what is hidden? Because for me, within my own practice, within the scholarship of teaching and learning, I'm helping others to see the unseen. I'm helping them to see things not by providing answers, but encouraging different ways of asking, different ways of thinking about what matters most. So think about the choice of the vision that you have. And I know that the IFNTF has a vision to inspire, but they're also aspiring to get fellows, national teaching fellows on board to share, to discuss, debate, and challenge current thinking as well. So how does that vision unfold? And what are the drivers to make it happen? So what I want to do on the next few slides is really start setting the scene of why I engage with SoTL. I also want to talk about the problem from being alone to being in a bigger group. How do we bring that power together through the sense of not only building the landscape, but more importantly, in my work, it's about building the learnscape. How do we place and position learners, academics, scholars within the landscape of learning? And what then matters most? So the challenges we face in the UK, can they be similar challenges to colleagues that are working in Australia and the States in other parts of the world? And what brings us together and connects us? Is it that we just are curious and want to work with colleagues? Or is it that we are trying to look at a lens, a vision, a focus on a particular issue from multiple lenses, multiple ideas, to understand what could potentially be possible? Then I'm going to talk to you about a nexus model that I'm working on, which is a way of designing and developing the networks. And then we can go back to the future to think about what could happen next. Some of you may have seen this work. This is the work of Cohn et al. 2015, and it's called the DART model. And what it does, it talks about different aspects of scholarship, from an informal to a systematic way, from working in the private to working in the outgoing, the public sphere. So if we start here, practice of teaching, just on the left of my screen, These could be informal ideas that you may challenge within the passages of your work. Challenges about how do I change my teaching based on feedback? How do I design and develop a course? What would be useful in thinking about our lesson plans? And these may be private thoughts, just the thinking, engaging that flame that has now been lit to think about how do I move from that private, from that silo into the open space? And what they also then said, well, let's share that thought, speaking to another person about a blog that you may have written and why you decided to do so. How do I share my thought? Maybe putting my work out there in a smaller group to receive some feedback to enhance the work or transform it. Maybe I do a presentation to a group of students or staff about the work I'm doing, or show how I've applied theory in practice. And then as we move into the formal, as we move into the outgoing side, we move more away from that private thought into what we call the scholarship ideas, scholarly teaching and learning. How do we use the classroom as our research? How do we engage with our teaching and learning from a literature evidence-informed approach? In the UK, we have a national framework which is administered through Advanced HE, which allows colleagues to receive fellowship at multiple levels. And one of the key dimensions is really around how do we embed scholarship within our teaching and learning work. And then the highest level within this particular model, when we make available and public our work, then we have moved into the realm of the scholarship of teaching and learning, which is that research identity. But often it's difficult to make a case for scholarship, especially if we're working in a world where research has to have rigor, it has to have a set pattern, it's informed and influenced through our discipline, but at the same time, it's valuable in terms of thinking about the ideas that we receive and we glean when we work with our scholarly lens. So I just want to frame this just as an idea to provoke a discussion right at the end. So in 2013, my colleague Peter Felton, who's in the States, he's a professor of history at Elon Higher Education Center in the East Coast of the States. And what he came up with was 5 pillars of doing what he called good SoTL. So he said, firstly, in order for SoTL to be effective, SoTL standing for Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, you have to have an inquiry into good student learning. So the lens here is not really on how we teach, but how we help students make visible their learning, which is a powerful way of thinking about that flipped approach. So what opportunities do you, for example, create within your context of teaching and learning to enable your students to make visible their learning? How do we know they have learned? How do we know that their learning is meaningful? How do you help a student become a student is the summary of that particular thought in part 1. In part 2, we cannot divorce good learning from the context in which it occurs. So context matters. In other words, can we simply think about teaching and learning from a global lens without thinking about the challenges of the context in which that teaching and learning occurs? So he grounded context as fundamental to framing the scholarly outputs from SoTL. Then he said, in order for SoTL to be understood, recognized, and valued, we must use robust methods. The methods we use in our research must be grounded or rooted in an inquiry framework. It cannot just be that we've spoken to a colleague and the colleague has said X and we write it up as a study, because that will be challenged. what approaches are useful. And often we see that certain fields of study struggle moving from a scientific or positivistic framework to a social science framework, where they have to interpret, where they have to construct. So this is really a categorization of epistemologies against the ways of doing, the ontological shifts. And that's important in SoTL. Then in part 4, in order for SoTL to be recognized as scholarship of teaching and learning, it should be conducted in partnership with students. In other words, students are the topic of the inquiry, or students become the co-creators of the end product. So you're working in partnership to understand the lenses of the learners so that the work is impactful and meaningful in terms of thinking about how it's being applied. But all of those, 1, 2, 3, 4, could be broadly assumed or consumed under the banner of scholarship. But to move from scholarship to SoTL, what we need to then do is make our findings available to others in appropriate ways. So that could be we write the article, or we could produce the artifact, the wikis, the podcasts, the websites. So making those resources available so others can learn, but also others can provide feedback to further refine, enhance the work we're doing. So what has happened is that those steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 categorize what good SoTL means. Recently, which came out this morning, is an article. That's all great that we can think about good SoTL, but how do we make it great? And there's a new piece of work looking at academic rigor within the context of SoTL. How do we make our case for SoTL was the key question. And maybe that's one that we can discuss at the end. In 2023, Lauren Schaff and a team around her launched what they call the Grand Challenges for SoTL. This was a project driven through iSoTL, the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, but these are not challenges for the iSoTL, these are challenges for the scholarship of teaching and learning. And what they did is identified 5 global issues, challenges that face SoTL. Now, what they defined a challenge as was a wicked issue or problem for which there's not one single answer, but they invite multiple lenses to consider how we could discuss, debate, and think about potential ways forward. So the first one, which a colleague on this call used as one of her words or their words, was around how do we foster creativity and criticality in our students? How do we do that? How do we help students become creative? How do we help students become critical? And students here could mean staff as well. What does deep engagement in learning mean? What does it look like within the context of your work? How do we know that students are deeply engaging? Then how do we understand the complexities of learning? What is the challenge of learning? And I know that we're probably thinking about that in terms of the advent, advancement, and rapid growth of things like AI. And is that part of the answer, or is that the threat? So really thinking about how we either brace and avoid or embrace and flourish in terms of thinking about what does the complexity of learning look like within this global challenge? And then how do we understand, identify with our teaching and learning? What hats are we wearing? How many roles are we playing? So I wear a discipline hat, but I wear a SoTL hat. I wear the hat of the lived, I wear the hat of the learnt, and I wear the hat of the led. But how do I really think about these different roles, identities, and how they impact the work I do? A lot of the students I teach are curious to know why I've decided and designed the class in the way I have. What has my past brought to my present? So really thinking about that, and there's been a lot of work around building that culture, identities in teaching and learning. So the first four are really inwards facing, where the fifth one, the promotion and growth, is really about how do we promote, how do we grow, how do we transform our practice of SoTL, and how do we build a case for SoTL in our worlds? In other words, what's important? And we may look at these and think, well, okay, these are global issues, but there may be others that are more relevant for the context in which we work. So maybe in Australia, there's a different type of challenge. In the States, there may be additional ones. But what they did through a research piece is identify these as the major hooks onto which we can build understanding and really try to work towards thinking about this within the context of our work. So I'm going to use the fifth one as the hook to lead the next few slides. So this is really around the grand challenge for the promotion and growth of SoTL, mainly through nurturing the networks and establishing the rapports, relationships that are going to be useful to us. So some of you, I'm sure, have all heard this term, the building of knowledge, epistemologies. But at the same time, as we build and promote, we need to be mindful of a colonized or decolonized wording, which is epistemicide, right at the top. And that is also around the systematic destruction of knowledge. And SoTL has been critiqued at times because it uses westernized ideas, westernized methods, and it often does not really think about that inclusion and diversification through which SoTL happens in different parts of the world, different regions, different cultures. So by me using a single theory, or by me using a taxonomy of questions that is rooted in westernized thinking, am I destroying thoughts or thought clusters from other worlds? And how do we really think about what holds as truth or what holds as a challenge? And the skills for the 21st world is really embedded in this world of who becomes the expert. Is it that students, for example, are turning to AI as their critical friend, as their learning partner, and are academics seeing that as a risk? Or can AI, for example, be one of the issues that we need to research, challenge, and look at how we embrace it as a form for learning, a pedagogy within itself? What are the risks? How do we keep the human perfectly within that loop? And my question that I often ask, as you can see there, what will be humanly possible in the future if students can get access to answers at the click of a button? How accurate? How do we need to embrace that? How do we need to move from our siloed views, the ways that we may think about this, to embracing it and discussing and really exposing the tensions that could exist within that particular world? So let's move on and think about, at times we involved in this twisted idea. We've got all our threads, all our components that make us us, identify us as us. So we may have our research strands, our taught strands, our scholarly strands, and at times we may find that they're twisted in a certain way, and it's difficult for us to untwist. So how do we move from that twisted sense to a tapestry where we can understand how each individual thread is woven through our life journey, how we can make explicit and clear the work that we're doing, but the connections between our work? So, for example, if we look at the green threads, that could be starting out as a solar piece of work. So we start out, then we interact with groups that refine it, enhance it, and grow it. And then we may decide that we need to leave that group and reflect upon our learning and move forward which could then lead to a different type of tapestry above. So it's really how we weave our lives and our work and our scholarly work in and through our particular journeys. So I just wanted to frame that as a potential image to evoke and provoke a discussion at the end. So thinking about the landscape or the landscape, how do we build bridges or tapestries? So what is the challenge of working alone? Often I speak to colleagues who say, well, they like to work alone, and that's fine. They prefer to work alone. They know that they're accountable if they work alone, but it's their ideas, their recipes. Others will say, well, in order to get started in a particular field, I want to work in a group to grow and transform and develop these ways of working. So the challenge is, do we need to build a bridge from working alone to working in groups? We also know that SoTL could be a fragmented way of working, different ideas that if we put our ideas out to the rest of the world as a global challenge, what is that risk of being judged? What is that risk and that fear? And how important is judgment in our scholarly work? And then how do we make sure that our work is transformed, it becomes stronger? How do we rewire our thinking? And a good colleague of mine called Jessica Riddell from Bishop's University in Canada, I don't know if there's colleagues on the call from that part of the world, but she's just written a remarkable book called Circuits of Hope, where the intention of that book is to disrupt at the root cause, HE, and to really rewire it for our futures. It's not a question of one size fits all. She argues one size fits one. And it's that power of one in terms of what is meaningful within the context in which I work. It's wonderful to borrow ideas and thoughts, but equally important to make sure that the solutions we find are relevant for the context in which we work. So the idea on this slide is not merely forming, but being able to flourish and perform and driving ideas forward. So while there is a single tree, the roots are running deep, and the roots are reliant on other forms of life under the ground. So in other words, you may see a person working alone, but we need to be able to see the unseen. In other words, how are they connected in and through the work that they do? And it may be that there's a perception they're working alone, but actually they may be working with a smaller group that is growing their tree, allowing their thoughts and ideas to flourish. So I'd like to just talk about Nexus. And Nexus, we have a building at our campus called Nexus. And Nexus actually means joining or connections. And what I want to discuss over the next few slides are really the alignments, connections between people, place, purpose as well. So the Nexus model is a work that's ongoing, but thinking about the power of being together within the space of a network. So the structure builds from an individual, institutional, to an international level. And it's really about understanding how the individual interacts with the space, place, and dynamics of the center that they're in, the institution, and how that then interacts within a global market. And we've all seen of late this idea of multiple campus branching. In other words, in certain parts of the world, we have higher education centers setting up remote or satellite sites in and through the same space. So, for example, in the Middle East, in Dubai, you can choose to do a module from a uni in Australia, a module from a uni in the UK, in the States, so forth and so on. So what does that global lens tell us? And how are students shuffling between they're learning space, they're learning science, and how they identify with what it is they're learning in preparation for a future that we are still creating and working through and defining. So a lot to think about. But before I get there, the thinking behind the premise, the predications on which the Nexus model is built, is actually drawn out of the taxonomy of SoTL-related questions, which was introduced in 1999 by two leading scholars at the time, Pat Hutchins and Schulman. And they asked the different types of questions. And recently, a couple of weeks ago, iSoTL held their 20th anniversary conference in the States. And these four questions were the themes that wove their way through the discussions. And the first question is, what is type questions? What is it that I'm aiming to achieve? Second one, what works, but equally, what doesn't work? And how do I know? Then they moved into, based on what works, what could the vision of the future be? How could I share this? How could I extend it? And out of that, what new theories could emerge as a result of that? So they thought about the value of these kinds of questions in helping us design a network that could be impactful for our future. What is it that we are creating? How do we know the network is working the way we want it to? What could additionalities to the network become? And how could the network influence future scholarly work? So, how do we identify with and nurture individual scholars and their motivations for joining a network? So think about this in your own space and time. What motivated you to join this meeting this morning? What motivated you to join the IFNTF? What motivated you to join a network that you part of? How do we develop essential skills to enable others to participate, not to just be a passenger, but to actively engage? How do we feel part of? How do we shape, not just being, but belonging as part of that? And how do we then build, foster that culture of working together, collaboration? So we are thinking about these particular questions in terms of the first view are reflective, inward facing, questions around why should I join? What value would joining a network add to my work? How would a network contribute to my scholarly work, for example? So they're really about, if I join, what will the network give me? The second phase is, what can I bring? Outward facing. What value would I bring to a particular group? What could I add to it? What connections do I have that may be useful in helping a network grow? And what would success or successful contribution to that network look like, either in the present or in the future? How do I evaluate the contribution that I bring or could bring? So that's on the first level. The second level, moving from there to the center level, how do we foster, create that space, environments within our own work to grow, for example, SoTL? What needs to happen? Is that a policy change? Is that a value change? Now, last year, 2023, I was fortunate to become the first professor at my Center for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And what happens is that you apply, you go through a process, you have an interview. And at the panel, they asked me, why do you want to be recognized in the scholarship of teaching and learning? And what value would that recognition bring to yourself? But equally, what would it bring to this particular center? And I had to argue that in terms of, well, what kind of money, what kind of funds are you going to be bringing in? And I said, it's not about bringing in these huge project funds. It's really about inspiring and making sure that our teaching and learning is solid so that staff inspire students. Students feel that this is the space and place they want to be. And through that positive creation of space, students flourish. So the proof is not in these grants, but the proof is in learning to rewire the groundwork to enable students and staff to actually flourish. But what is being seen and the unseen is that we constantly need to make a case for the value of SoTL. Why is it important? Because SoTL is often seen as an answer to a particular issue. Things have gone wrong. Could we look at a SoTL approach to try and solve it? And then you wield back into your world and don't be seen again. But a lot of centers now are placing value and recognition in thinking about how the power of SoTL could be useful and transformative within that higher education landscape. But in order to make it impactful, we need to think about the resources and the structures we need to drive it forward. Canada and Australia are leading the space on this in terms of actually having centers for SoTL and really driving through the research and making sure that the SoTL thread is firmly woven into the research, the teaching and learning, and the knowledge exchange tapestry within HE. And Jessica Riddell in her Hope Circuit book argues for that in terms of actually entertaining, inviting voice to weave our tapestries for our future. So just to signpost that. And then the last one, how do we build these bridges? So there's two important things. How do we build a relationship with a global colleague? And then how do we build a partnership? So this particular network is powerful in building both relationships between colleagues, but partnerships between this particular network and other international networks. And how do we exact and facilitate knowledge exchange? What new ideas could be brought in to help us stand out as opposed to become outstanding? And what are those particular hurdles, barriers that we face? For example, time, the time zone. Can we all meet at the same time? Some of you are probably still waking up this morning. Others are later in the day. But there are those particular structures that enable us to be in the same space at the same time. Or if it's not live engagement, we can watch it back. And that is important because ever since the pandemic hit, that was a shift in changing the way we think, changing the way we work, changing the way we interact across a screen, but also the power of when we do meet in person, how we maximize our time, maximize our exchange of ideas. So networks could be powerful in multiple ways. They can either help us to drive forward ideas, but if they are produced or created in the wrong way, without intent, without thought, without thinking about the landscape, there could be a power drain where colleagues simply take out of the network without adding to it. And this I've seen in multiple ways where few hands are doing the most work, but yet others are gaining from it. So can you still be in silo as part of a group? And I think the answer is yes, but it's how that group makes you feel safe enough that you feel this is the right group, the network to be part of, because you're clear about the mission, you're clear about the road ahead, you're clear about those lines. But at the same time, taking too much out of that group could be the downfall. So it's really how does the group or the network safeguard and protect its values, ideals, and ways of working? So creating, enabling spaces for SoTL, implementing a supportive way of working, and providing those resources to make it work are critical components in enabling the networks, the structures we build to flourish. So I'd like you to use your own practice or context to consider How does this happen in your space? Are you supported in and through your work? Are you constantly knocking on doors to ask for resource? And if the answer is no, we can't, what other ways are there of making it work? So are we fixated on receiving an answer, or is the real issue that we face that we haven't yet learned to ask the right question? And how do we transform our thinking from just receiving, responding to an answer, to actually thinking about what question would be the most meaningful to ask in order to build that drive as opposed to that drain? I'm looking at my watch, so I know we've only got a few minutes left before we go into Q&A. So I've got the last two slides, and then I'll pause. So how does your work or in interest help you to emphasize the importance, for example, of SoTL? How do you encourage others to join and lead? And what is the future? What could we be thinking about? And then the question I'm asking on this slide, is there a place for AI in the future of our work? And how would we think it through? What are the risks? What could we achieve? And are we gaining more by interacting with the machine in our writing, in our ideas? Or do we still need to keep the human? I know my answer, but this is a hook for you as well. Final slide now. A network, if it's built well, could define your net worth, the way that you lead, the way that you inspire. Often when I need a reference, I go to the networks I'm working with, because those are the voices that can speak to the work I've done. Those are the ones that can see whether I've made visible the way I lead, the way I teach, the way I learn. The focus on a network is not about giving answers, but encouraging and inspiring the creation of questions. Think about the value that you bring, the impact of the groups that you work with, the impact that you can bring in working alone, but joining a group, and how you reach, or the reach of those groups. And those terms, value, impact, and reach, are often used as a award or reward factor. And how do we create a sustainable network to serve our future goals? So two questions and a third to end off with. How can networks or groups be valuable with me? How can they be valuable to me? And who gets to attend? Who are we excluding within these groups? Who should we add? And is that a human or is that a machine? And with that, I'm happy to take questions, but equally stop sharing so we can engage in some of the thinking that may have occurred alongside the slides. Back to you, Tina.
Thank you so much. That was very